Welcome to this short talk about making lectures work. And the first thing I want to say is that I'm not here to tell you how to teach, but rather I want to initiate an exchange of ideas, and I hope this is a useful starting point. So the learning objectives for this talk are to be able to recall the potential strengths and weaknesses of lectures, to be able to discuss and reflect on ways that lectures can be improved, to be able to describe the peer instruction methodology, and to be able to recall practical considerations and recent developments in terms of the lecture format. So as an overview, we'll start with an introduction, look at some of these strengths and weaknesses, think about improving lectures and how we can make them work better. We'll then round up with some practical considerations and further developments. So to start with, the first thing to say is that didactic lectures have been around for hundreds of years. The picture shown here is from the University of Bologna. It shows a lecture in the mid-14th century, and as you can see, the lecturer is at the front reading from a book and the students in the back are falling asleep. So some might argue that not a lot has changed. What has undoubtedly changed in the last 700 years is that lectures are now no longer the only means for knowledge transfer. They're no longer the only way that knowledge can be transmitted. So the printing press, the internet, means that information is ubiquitous. It's everywhere. It can be transmitted at any time in lots of different formats. So surely the challenge has now moved to helping students judge the quality of this information and then to assimilate the relevant right information in order to synthesize a complex and deep understanding of a subject. Some potential weaknesses of the didactic lecture format are shown here. I'm going to go through these one by one, and I've adapted these from Cashin 1985 and from Bonwell 1996. So to start with, lectures provide no mechanism to monitor how students are learning and how much they're taking in. The focus is really on getting through the material rather than ensuring that the students are understanding. Also, students can be passive during a lecture because there's no mechanism of ensuring that students are engaging with the material. There's actually been lots of work looking at what the students are thinking about during lectures, and I think you'd find the results surprising. Thirdly, if students are passive, then information is more likely to be forgotten quickly. Often the lecture length is longer than the average attention span. The lecture format also assumes that everyone learns at the same pace and level. And lectures aren't particularly well suited to the development of higher order thinking skills, or for teaching motor skills, or for influencing attitudes or values. They're also not necessarily well suited to teaching complex or abstract material, and this is because as the material becomes more difficult, then these differences in the pace and level of understanding from the students in the audience becomes more pronounced. So as the material becomes more difficult, the pace of learning can become more differentiated between the learners. Engaging delivery of a lecture requires an effective public speaker, which isn't necessarily a prerequisite for being a lecturer, and lectures are mainly focused on learning by listening. Now, for all of these weaknesses, I don't think the lectures are going away. There seems to be a general expectation that universities are going to have lectures, and that subject specialists within universities are going to pass on their knowledge via lectures. That just seems to be the general expectation, that we're going to have lectures in universities. So, to look at some of the potential strengths of lectures then, lecturers in a lecture can model how professionals in a particular discipline think, and they can show how to approach a problem or a question, and they can really model how to tackle a certain situation. Enthusiastic lecturers can convey their interest in a subject, and so well-delivered lectures can actually motivate students to learn. Lectures enable the lecturer to maintain control over the learning experience, and we can also use lectures to set out the syllabus and the material that students need to go away and learn in more detail for themselves, we can paint this broad brush picture of the information, but students will need to go and take some time to assimilate that for themselves in their own time. A skillful lecturer can explain difficult concepts in a simple yet effective manner. That's a real art and a real skill, to take very abstract concepts and make them concrete and make them understandable. Also, lectures can aggregate and organise and distill a really wide range of different information into a coherent story for the learners in that lecture. So in terms of making improvements to lectures and making them work better, there's been a number of recommendations made by different authors, and for example, Cash in 1985 shares 27 different hints and tips for improving lectures, and these are organised into different themes. So there's a theme around preparation and organisation, then there's a few hints and tips around presentation and clarity, and also then more hints and tips for stimulation and interest, and also for feedback and interaction. It's also been suggested that interspersing lectures with opportunities for active learning can mitigate many of the weaknesses of didactic lectures. So suggested activities to get you started, things like formative quizzes, discussion questions, mini writing assignments, but there are many more sort of potential activities that could be used to get the students actively involved in the learning process rather than being passive, just passively listening. And providing these opportunities for active learning can really be beneficial in lots of different ways. Students get feedback on how they're progressing and their comprehension of the material. These learning activities, this active learning can refocus attention during the lecture, and they can also facilitate the development of higher order thinking skills. A formalised strategy and approach to introducing active learning into the lecture room is called peer instruction. This was devised by Eric Mazur over in the States in Harvard Physics, and it's a formalised way of getting active learning into the classroom. So to start with, during the lecture, students are given a conceptual question to answer. They are given a few minutes to think about that and to vote on an answer using some sort of response system, either an app or a voting pad. They are then encouraged to discuss their answer with each other, and this is really useful. They can start to explain their reasoning behind an answer, and hopefully those that have just understood it and can explain it really well to those who haven't understood it yet, and hopefully more of the class will then understand. And the second vote, students can change their answer. They can obviously stick to their answer if they're convinced of it, but this is really an opportunity to just sort of take away the learning from the peer-to-peer learning in stage 3, and this time the result of this vote is actually shared. In the first vote the results aren't shared because otherwise students will just go with the highest answer. They'll just use wisdom of the crowd and go with the most popular vote on the second vote, but that's not the idea. The idea is to use that discussion, that peer-to-peer interaction, to improve understanding. Finally then, as I've said, the results are shared, but also you can take a bit of time to explain the answer and why that was the correct answer before moving on to a bit more of the lecture or another question. So benefits around this: it's facilitating peer-to-peer learning through discussion. Students are getting formative assessment with instant feedback. We can track the progress of students and help them to identify areas for further study. It taps into the benefits of retrieval practice and also exploits the forward testing effect. So just to pause for a moment and just think about this this sort of argument between discursive and didactic lectures. You know, we've already said lectures are going to continue to be used in higher education, and the arguments around their effectiveness are likely to rumble on. But what seems to be key is that we need to move lectures from being a purely didactic format where students are passive receptacles to be filled up with knowledge. We need to move it actually more towards a discursive format where students are an active part of the learning process. So some practical considerations: it's considered good practice to provide supporting materials online to get them onto the VLE at least 48 hours in advance of the session. This enables students who have particular accessibility needs to be able to print a copy in a format that's accessible to them. So if it's lecture slides or if it's tutorial questions, they can actually get that printed out in a format they can use during the lecture. On that note, in terms of making your documents accessible and user-friendly, there are some really good recommendations at the website shown. So further developments, the ways that lectures have been adapted and changed in recent years, there's things like screencasting that are coming along, podcasting and lecture capture. Now I'm not going to go into any detail on these things, but I've provided some starting point references. These are papers that you could perhaps have a look at as a starting point and find others. So if you wanted to find out more about these developments, then obviously you can dig into the literature yourself. The references that have been used are shown here, and it just remains for me to say thank you for watching.